Hello and welcome to the Yak, the wide receiver analysis podcast for Week 16 in the NFL. I'm Big Italy 42. He's Josh Shepardson at BChad50. And of course, we're talking about your top options at wide receiver. And since Odell Beckham Jr. is suspended, there's not much of a decision up at the top here. And although Lawrence Tynes seems to think that he's not anymore, and everyone hates him for saying it, either way, Antonio Brown, regardless of status of any other player, aside from Ben Roethlisberger, that is, he's always one of your top options on the week. And the Steelers barely in the playoffs as of now, still in win-now mode. And quite frankly, the teams ahead of them want them to win right now so that the higher seeds don't want to play them. And you just don't envision a scenario where either A, Baltimore stops Antonio Brown, or B, Baltimore keeps this game that close necessarily. So, I mean, Pittsburgh's going to win the game, and Antonio Brown's going to be a big reason for it, as he is pretty much every week.
Yeah, and I mean, the scary thing is last week was supposed to be a tough matchup for Antonio Brown. All he did was catch 16 of 18 targets for 189 yards and 2 scores against the best pass defense in the league. So if he's doing that, I feel good running him out against anybody. And this isn't just anyone. This is a bad Baltimore Ravens secondary. They are struggling to stop receivers from scoring. I mean, they've given up the most touchdown grabs to receivers this year, according to Pro Football Reference, and they've given up the fourth most DraftKings points per game and the fourth most FanDuel points per game to wideouts. So, I mean, it's been easy sledding for all receivers this year, and Antonio Brown's slightly better than all receivers. And just to kind of put things in perspective, how good he's been with Big Ben, his per-game averages are 13.4 targets, 9.9 receptions, 134.9 yards receiving, and he's got 9 touchdowns in 10 games. So you're getting a touchdown a game with it as well. So, I mean, you're getting just a buttload of points, basically, and there's nobody in the secondary that's going to slow down Antonio Brown.
No, it's just not going to happen. And speaking of guys who can't be slowed down, Doug Baldwin is on a ridiculous pace of touchdowns, at least over the past, 4 or so weeks here. People were joking that it was a disappointment that he only scored 2 touchdowns last week when he had been scoring 3 per week. And obviously with a little bit of flux in the situation for the running backs here, obviously Christian Michael did perform pretty well last week. So some more consistency there. But in all reality, that's not going to take away from the passing game. That's just going to take away the pressure from the passing game. But Russell Wilson has been just so damn good that it doesn't matter. And Doug Baldwin is a lot of that reason why.
Yeah, I mean, Doug Baldwin has been the number one for them. They've gotten some good performances from Tyler Lockett and Jermaine Kearse, but Baldwin's the guy that's getting the ball in the red zone. He's scoring touchdowns. The fact that he's been such a touchdown machine lately elevates that floor. I mean, like last week, he had 4 receptions for 45 yards, which would be a disappointment at basically his price point or most price points. But then it was picked up by not 1 touchdown, but 2 touchdowns. Even with just 1 touchdown, you're getting 14 and change on DraftKings from him. The fact that he can catch that touchdown to save his fantasy line is a big deal. The fact that he can score multiple touchdowns elevates the ceiling, which makes him a great play in GPPs as well. And the nice thing is we keep talking about touchdowns, but he's not just a touchdown-dependent receiver. During his 6-game run where he's been on fire, he's averaging 5.6 receptions and 93.3 yards receiving per game. So he's pushing 100 yards receiving and almost 6 receptions a game, too. So he's not just a touchdown scoring machine. He's a guy that's getting yardage. He's a guy that's getting receptions. He's facing a tough secondary. But the nice thing with Baldwin is he's not your traditional number one. He doesn't play a ton of outside receiver. He plays the slot quite a bit. And Pro Football Focus's matchup grades shows that he's probably going to draw LaMarcus Joyner in coverage. And that's a much nicer assignment than either Trumaine Johnson or Janoris Jenkins. Joyner ranks 65th at cornerback, according to Pro Football Focus. Meanwhile, Jenkins ranks 21st and Trumaine Johnson ranks 4th. And I would add that even if either of the top corners for St. Louis moves into guard Baldwin in the slot, it's a different animal guarding a slot receiver without the aid of that sideline. We talked about it last week with OBJ against Josh Norman. Same idea applies here. You get him in space. It's a little bit tougher when you don't have that sideline as the extra defender, basically.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's a good reason to get pieces of these potent passing attacks recently. Steelers and Seahawks among the best right now. Not quite the situation with the next guy, Kamar Aiken with the Ravens, but he is the one lone bright spot, the one actual target on this entire offense. And as we mentioned earlier, they're going to be behind to the Steelers. They're going to have to be throwing the ball, and Kamar Aiken's the only guy that seems capable of making plays down the field for them right now. So it makes sense to target him as a cheap guy. That he did have a decent game last week, a good game last week at really low ownership. So you imagine there'll be a little bit higher ownership on him than there would have been, but certainly not enough to scare anyone off.
Yeah, and he's been surprisingly consistent this year. He's bested 70 yards receiving in 7 contests this season. He's tallied 50 receiving yards or more in 9 contests. So we're talking about a pretty high floor for the guy. Since the Week 9 bye for the Ravens, he's averaging 10.33 targets per game, 6.17 receptions, 78.17 receiving yards per game, and he has 3 touchdowns in that time frame. So he's catching touchdown passes from everybody. I mean, he's putting up numbers with anybody at quarterback. He's done it with Flacco this year. He's done it with Schaub. He's done it with Clausen. And I venture to say that if Ryan Mallett gets the nod this week, he's going to do it with Ryan Mallett under center too. And pointing to what Ryan Mallett did earlier in the season, we know he's willing to get the ball to his number 1 receiver. Look at what DeAndre Hopkins did with them. Not to say that Aiken's the same talent level at receiver, but it is to say that he's the clear-cut one, much like DeAndre Hopkins is in Houston. Got to expect that if Mallett's out there, he's going to air the ball out Aiken's way quite a bit. Aiken knocking on the door of 1,000 yards as well. Just 197 yards short with 2 games left to play. If he's going to get there, this is going to be the game that's really going to put him in that position to get to the 1,000-yard threshold, which is a magical number for receivers, as most listeners know. But he's going to have to do some work this week because he's got a tough assignment in Week 17. But this week, the Steelers have struggled mightily defending wide receivers. They've given up a ton of fantasy points. And Aiken coming off of a career-best game with 128 yards receiving and a touchdown last week. I look for him to build on that this week. Maybe not best last week's numbers, but put in another strong effort. Possibly hit triple digits in receiving yards again.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, they're going to be throwing, and like you said, I mean, he's a good option, not only the only option, but definitely helps that he's not really battling anyone else for touches there. Outside of that, next up we've got Travis Benjamin, a guy who we know is a deep ball threat. He's a guy that we know can be a volume target guy. At least hasn't had many huge catch games, but certainly some big time potential with him. Throwing down the field, especially with Johnny Manziel likes to throw down the field, and you know, it's a Chiefs team that a lot of people are going to be on in the defense, so it gives you even low ownership because you're going to see a lot of people on the Chiefs defense. Browns, of course, going to be behind in this game. I mean, I'd be stunned if they weren't. They're going to need to throw the ball down the field, and they don't have any other down-the-field threats. I mean, you got Gary Barnidge in the medium passing game, but he's not a deep threat. He's a huge lumberjack-like tight end.
Yep, and oddly, this is the second value receiver who's knocking on the door of a 1,000-yard season. He's actually closer than Aiken is, 107 yards receiving short right now. I mean, he's only got to average just over 50 yards receiving per game to get to that mark. I expect him to get there, but this is a matchup that's good for him. As great as that Chiefs defense is, the one chink in the armor, you could say, is they've given up the 5th most DraftKings and FanDuel fantasy points to receivers this year, so receivers can get to them. Unlike Aiken, who I would use in all game types, Benjamin, more of a GPP-only play, even with just a really good price tag that might seem appealing in cash games, but the floor is not quite high enough to advocate him there. But the ceiling is high. He's a guy that can get behind the defense. He's averaging 14.6 yards per reception, which is a hardy total. And he's got 2+ yard receiving games with Johnny Manziel playing quarterback this year. So we've seen the two of them work well together. As you mentioned, Manziel does like to throw the ball down the field. He is also a mobile guy, unlike Josh McCown. I mean, Josh McCown was, in his earlier years, not quite the mobile guy that he was then. Manziel is a spry guy who can break a tackle and keep a broken play alive and out down the field. That is just the type of quarterback who blends perfectly with Benjamin because he can blow the top off of a defense. He can get behind the secondary. And when those things happen, Benjamin's good for a long touchdown grab. And honestly, one long touchdown grab is enough to pay off his salary at FanDuel or DraftKings. Having a guy like that on your roster can be helpful. And the fact that he does have a higher ceiling than just one long touchdown grab also makes him appealing in GPPs.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point there. Next up after him, we have John Brown. And you mentioned recency bias. We talk about it all the time. People saw him drop some passes, and seeing people say they burned him. I mean, I had some John Brown myself, and he, on a full PPR site, wasn't that bad. I think he got 11.9 points, something of that nature. So, I mean, it was okay, but if you didn't watch the game, you think, well, that was all right. I was shooting for something big. No worries. But if you're on Twitter or you watch the game, of course you know he could have had a huge game. So still could have a huge game in this one. And definitely, I mean, so many weapons for this Arizona team. You're never going to see enormous ownership for anyone not named David Johnson. I mean, more so the wide receivers. But definitely a guy that recency bias is going to keep him lower than he probably should be in what is going to be a huge battle this week.
Yeah, and I mean, this sets up perfectly for low ownership for Brown because that game was on Sunday Night Football. It was a primetime game. It wasn't lost in the 1 o'clock slate with a million games on it. Everybody was watching, and if you're watching, John Brown gets behind the secondary. He had what would have been a 60-plus yard touchdown reception if he'd hauled it in. Hit him directly in the hands, and he dropped it. Those type of big plays that are highlighted stick in the mind of gamers sometimes, especially if you were an owner who used him, could have used those points. I think that's going to drive his ownership down a little bit. But one thing that's easy to lose sight of in last week's game with David Johnson going nuts for over 200 yards from scrimmage is that John Brown was the most targeted member of that receiving group, most targeted member on the team. He had 9 targets. So even with the drops, Carson Palmer is still willing to air it out to him, and he did still catch a touchdown pass. So John Brown, good red zone threat, good long threat, can really blow the top off of a defense. And again, his price point is fairly low, $6,400 on FanDuel, $5,300 on DraftKings. Like Benjamin, one long reception, and he can pay off his salary on either site. The nice thing is for Brown, he's working with a slightly better quarterback than Johnny Manziel and has some other threats to maybe take some pressure off of him and get him that single coverage so he can get behind a defender. So really like John Brown this week, and I don't see his ownership eclipsing 15% at the high end on FanDuel and DraftKings. I think he's closer to low double digits, maybe 10% ownership. People are going to see the total. They're going to like the total of 26 and change for the Cardinals. So you'll see some people just stick just based on that total alone, but I just can't see his ownership being very high this week.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense there. Devante Parker next up, a guy who we talked about a little bit before the show, is the guy that I drafted a ton of season-long leagues. I loved hoping that he would have his big season. Hasn't quite had that, but he's had some more options and more opportunities, of course, with Rashard Matthews when he went down with an injury. So more to go around, but the issue with him being Ryan Tannehill, been very inconsistent this year. He's had huge upside, but his floor is about the same as just about any low-rung quarterback in the league. So he's probably the most volatile quarterback in the NFL, but when he has his big games, guys like Devante Parker certainly pay off.
Yeah, and this basically epitomizes what it means to be a GPP play. You're embracing volatility. You're taking on a rookie receiver who's playing with an erratic quarterback who can have a very good game or can put up just a complete clunker. We've seen both recently. And as you mentioned, Rashard Matthews' absence has paved the way for Parker to have a nice showing down the stretch. Over the last 4 games, he's caught 2 touchdowns, and he's averaged 6.5 targets, which isn't a big number, but he's turned that into 3.25 receptions, 61.5 yards receiving per game. So he's averaging almost 20 yards per reception over the last 4 games. Doesn't need a ton of work to make a big play. And the thing is he has at times gotten a bit of extra work. I think that this matchup basically seals the deal for me loving Devante Parker, though. Gets to face the Colts. The Colts have allowed the 3rd most DraftKings and FanDuel points per game to wide receivers this year. Outside of Vontae Davis, that secondary is an absolute mess. You don't expect Vontae Davis to shadow Devante Parker, so that means that Parker's going to see some matchups with some soft corners at some point this year or this week. And $6,000 on FanDuel and $4,100 on DraftKings. Not going to take much from him to provide a positive return on investment, but this is the GPP section of the receivers, so we're also looking for ceiling, and he certainly has that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. If you remember his college days, he had about as high of a ceiling as you've seen most years there. So he's certainly capable of monster games. That'll wrap things up here for us for Week 16. Find us on Twitter at DraftKings, or thinking about DraftKings here at DF Cafe. Follow us there, and then check out our YouTube channel. Subscribe to that, and check out everything else for NFL and NBA and all that at dailyfantasycafe.com.